everyone on the trusted panel and for the insights on blockchain and other security breakthroughs. Liquid Hub, and now Capgemini Invent, has been supporting Phorum since 2012 at its inception. Capgemini Invent is Capgemini's innovation, transformational digital business unit. And this year we're especially pleased to be sponsor Phorum and had the opportunity to introduce Scott Snyder as this year's keynote speaker. Scott, a partner at Heidrick & Struggles and fellow at the Wharton School, joins us today to explain the thesis of his new book, Goliath's Revenge: How Established Companies Turn the Tables on Digital Disruptors. Established companies are sitting on incumbent advantages, and they need to unlock these advantages by investing in a digital world and committing to three things: leadership, organization, and culture that can run on two speeds simultaneously. Innovating around today's business, as well as driving breakthroughs on the next generation of business. Being able to be both an incremental innovator as well as a breakthrough innovator is a key component in winning in today's time of digital disruption. This, of course, makes Scott and his book an ideal topic to this year's Forum topic, Become a Digital Disruptor. After this keynote, Peter Coffey will be joining Scott for Q&A and further discussion. Please help me welcome Scott Snyder.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Suzanne. I appreciate it. Sounds a bit contrarian, doesn't it? That established incumbents, typically the ones we associated with being slow, not innovative, can actually be disruptors. It's exactly the reason we wrote Goliath's Revenge. We felt like there was a story to be told around how established companies can leverage these legacy assets, whether it's their customer base, their data and insights, their expertise and knowledge around things like regulation, which we talked a lot about in the first two panels, or even things like trust and the notion of a brand. So how do you put those legacy assets to work? And as Suzanne alluded to, it's difficult. It requires a shift in mindset. It requires a shift in your approach to being a leader, how you organize to create that space for a second speed in your business. It also requires a different culture, a culture that can withstand constant tension and reinvention. Sometimes a comfortable culture is not the culture you need to continually be a disruptor in the future. So those are important points. But before we get into discussing the concept in the book, I wanted to show you a quick video. So if we could roll the video, I'd appreciate it.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests of very contradictory thoughts. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
How many people are old enough to remember that commercial? Okay, so we need more digital natives in the room. I am, of course. It was rather iconic. It won a couple of awards. Obviously has a lot of symbolism, right, with Bridget Nielsen throwing the sledgehammer being the, quote, disruptor, and the zombies in the audience being the establishment, the incumbents. But we see this playing out a lot today. And what's interesting about that video, before in 1983, Apple tried to launch a computer called the Lisa. It was kind of a failure. In 84, when they launched the Macintosh, they didn't invent computing. But what they did was they reinvented the user experience. And oddly enough, that user experience that they invented didn't come from them. It came from another large incumbent called Xerox. It was developed at Park Labs, the GUI, right, the graphical user interface. Xerox had been sitting on that for years, didn't know what to do with it, didn't know the value of this crown jewel that they had. Steve Jobs visited Park one day and said, "That's it." And he shamelessly took it and deployed it in the Macintosh. And of course, we were off to the races in terms of the experience actually mattering in computing. And of course, Apple pulled that trick again in 2007 with the iPhone. They didn't invent smartphones, but they reinvented the experience and, of course, the ecosystem around that. So a lot of times, incumbents are sitting on these crown jewels, and they don't realize exactly what they are. Where's Abhi? And of course, I'm going to pick on AT&T a little bit, but it's a little bit in the past. So a guy that we associate with disruption, one, Steve Jobs. Another one, if we go back in time, is a guy named Nikola Tesla. Tesla was, of course, known as a great scientist and inventor, but he was also a futurist. And imagine in 1926 coming out with this concept that we might actually have something that fits in our pocket that we could compute, communicate, and connect all of us around the world on. Tesla had that vision, and interestingly, it was 2 decades before the cellular concept was ever developed at Bell Labs. So, pretty big vision. Also, very ironic that he shares the same name as a car company that may be known as one of the more disruptive companies on the planet called Tesla, with a very radical, mutant, visionary kind of CEO and founder, Elon Musk, who also has founded 7 other companies that intend to disrupt their respective markets, like Neuralink and OpenAI and Hyperloop and SpaceX, right? So actually disrupting the space industry. In fact, if you go onto Tesla's website, yeah, you see things about cars, but what else do you see? You see things like talking about a new energy future, that if you have a Tesla, a solar panel, and a power wall, you can disconnect from the grid and get energy independence. Not a very popular thing for utility companies to hear. The other thing is SpaceX talks about a vision of we want to save humanity from its own destruction by inhabiting other planets. And of course, Elon Musk's big vision translates to many things. He has the new rocket that's going to take us to Mars called the BFR. The B stands for big, the R stands for rocket. You can fill in the middle, right? But sometimes we have to take a step back. It's easy to dismiss these radicals, these visionaries. Sometimes we actually have to pay attention to them. And this is where I get to have some fun with AT&T. In the past, back in 1984, the same time Steve Jobs was disrupting the world of computing, AT&T was being challenged by the government on antitrust and had to break up, right? So this was divestiture. They controlled pretty much all of telecommunications in the US. How many people remember one of these? Just to date yourself a little bit. For the privilege of paying $3,000, you got to stand in line at a Motorola authorized dealer, and you got to get one of these phones, a bag phone, or mount it on your car. It weighed about 10 pounds. It would last about 40 minutes if you were lucky in terms of battery life, and chances are you'd pick up somebody else's conversation because it was analog. But it was amazingly cool because you could talk anytime, anywhere. And there were a few 100,000 users of this technology back in 1984. AT&T had to decide what companies to divest, and this was one of them. So they did what most big companies do. They hired McKinsey to come in and do a forecast. And McKinsey went off and crunched the numbers, did a forecast, and they said, by the year 2000, we believe there will be a grand total of 1 million cellular subscribers in the world. How many do you think there actually were? 740 million. So just, approaching 1 billion. So off by more than a rounding error. And of course, AT&T took that data and made a decision and said, this business is too small, not that interesting. They sold it to a wily entrepreneur named Craig McCall, who then sold it back to AT&T about 10 years later for $11.5 billion. And of course, now AT&T Wireless is really the linchpin of the company. It's an amazing asset. But it just goes to show you really smart people can sometimes realize they're not sitting on crown jewels that they could unlock the value because it requires future vision and imagination of what it could be. And now, of course, we know these are indispensable, and we've built an entire innovation ecosystem around these platforms. Those same users that are using this are now creating a new kind of disruption. They're putting pressure back on your business, your platforms, to deliver on what we call the expectation ratchet. Just like ratchets that don't go backwards, the customer expectation of what experience they demand is going forward. And it has to be immersive. It's got to work on any touch point, whether it's a voice agent, a smartwatch, a set of VR goggles. It's got to be cognitive. It has to use data and AI to think ahead and anticipate user needs and personalize it. Especially if you're going to ask for my data, I expect that. You're going to be able to pull my calendar and the weather feed and tell me when to go for my run that's going to be optimal for today. And lastly, it's got to be trusted. We just heard a whole panel talking about trust and what it means and what it doesn't mean. Fundamentally, it's transparency, it's security, it's managing the give and the get with users in a way that I earn the right to collect more data and power my own data and insights. But if I don't earn that right and I get it wrong, as we talked about in the first panel, I might lose them. And of course, the danger in this is even the best get it wrong sometimes, right? So Amazon, with all their data and all their horsepower and algorithmic capability, even this user, maybe there are toilet seat collectors in the world, but somehow they didn't get this one right, in terms of anticipating the user's needs. So now, fortunately, Amazon gets it right most of the time, so they earn another chance, because most of the time they deliver an exceptional experience that is thinking ahead for us, but every once in a while, it's possible. Most of our companies don't get a second chance. If we get it wrong, then we start to fall back. And if we don't deliver on these expectations of the ratchet, we start to become part of the left half of this bimodal distribution. It's no longer good enough to be average in a digital world. We have to take our assets and we have to play them in a new way with the technologies available and the new ways of working, which we talked about already. And this is going to create haves and have-nots in the world. And we're seeing it in industry after industry, right? Starting with e-commerce, we talked about Amazon, 300 million users powering their algorithms, driving better decisions and interactions. But what else is Amazon doing? They're basically looking at what products people are buying. They're coming up with better products with Amazon own brand. And they're slowly crushing a lot of small product vendors as a result of that, because they have better data on what people want to buy, whether it's a pair of socks or a tube of toothpaste. The other company that's done this amazingly well is Netflix. Netflix takes 130 million users consuming 100 billion hours of content a week. That's a week. And they feed their algorithms to know what people want to watch when, what kind of shows and movies will play best with what kind of audiences. So if you look at the Emmy Awards from a year and a half ago, who would have thought that 9 of those Emmy Awards would have gone to Netflix and Amazon? They weren't even content companies a couple of years ago. So once again, disrupting not only their spaces, but now taking their algorithms and entering new spaces like media, which is pretty powerful. So I love this quote by Hemingway because it goes back to the thing I challenged you with at the beginning of the day. How much time do you really have as a company? It's easy to sit back and say what's made us successful is going to continue to perpetuate. But instead, if the world changes and we wake up and we're not equipped to deal with it because we haven't adopted AI, we haven't done the things we need to do to build a new kind of trust and transparency or innovated around data privacy, we may find ourselves on the wrong side of that distribution. I call this kind of the death march chart, right? The notion that being on top is not a stable position unless you continue to reinvent yourself. I like to say companies go through 3 phases. risk-taking, caretaking, and undertaking, right? And clearly, you don't want to be in the third bucket. And I would argue, whether you're a startup in this room or you're a large company, at one point in your life, I don't care if it was 150 years ago or 2 years ago, you were a startup. Somebody took a risk, somebody had a vision, somebody mortgaged their house to go fund a business because they were inspired by an idea, and they ran fast and they broke rules, and they did things in whatever way was necessary to move an idea forward. Somehow, when we become big, the layers and the weight of the organization start to dampen out the DNA of that startup that existed at one point in time. So the question is, how do we get it back? Especially for an incumbent. So let me talk about pizza, because we're getting close to lunch, and I like pizza. So this is the stock price for Domino's Pizza, which was in the tank when Patrick Doyle took over in 2010. It was about $8 a share. And as you can see, it's outperformed Google, Netflix, Amazon, Facebook over 7 years. How did Domino's Pizza do that, right? Traditional pizza company, struggling to survive, closing shops. So Patrick Doyle said we got to do two things. One is we got to fix the product. The pizza sucked. I was not a fan of Domino's Pizza, so he did some things to fix the product, raise the quality bar. But the second thing he did is said, we're going to deliver a step change in our experience using technology. So what did they do? They invested in new touch points that you could order pizza off of. Everything from Alexa to a button on a Nike shoe to be able to order. Second, they gave transparency. They created the first ever pizza tracker to allow you to see where your pizza is in the delivery chain. Third is they use sensors and algorithms to make sure when your pizza got there, it was the right temperature. They actually have a custom designed car called the DXP. It holds 80 pizzas in a warming oven, and they have sensors to make sure the pizzas are at the right temperature when they get to the customer. But maybe most interestingly, if you go to Ann Arbor to Domino's headquarters, there's 800 people in the building. 400 of them are developers and data scientists. That's a pizza company that's using technology to change the experience. So you think about that, in terms of people say this is all about consumer businesses and Amazon, a traditional business that's turned over its entire workforce to focus on delivering on that proposition. So once again, that's why we wrote the book. The stories of companies like Domino's that have figured out how to create that second gear and reinvent itself while it's running its current business. How do you do that? 6 ways. First is, you got to have a notion of what your step change outcome is, whether it's around the experience, whether it's around how you're changing it and dramatically disrupting your operating model, whether it's through partner networks. What is your 10x outcome that you're going to take your assets and your crown jewels and unlock? The second is, you've got to balance little I and big I. Little I is that everyday continual innovation around the current business to play the current game better, as Suzanne said, and it's really in the hands of your employees. How do we do that in a low-friction way and empower our employees to continually innovate around their job? Because they're closest to the customer, closest to the operation, and yet most companies aren't very good at that. There's a lot of innovation theater and hackathons and, let's try new ideas, and then it goes to the abyss and nothing happens. On the other side, if we're going to reinvent, we need to create space, courage, air cover for big I, for reinventing ourselves. And if it's disruptive, then by its nature, it's going to drive tension with all the people running the core business. So it can't be a distraction. It needs to be given space until it really takes root. It's going to have a high failure rate that's built in. Let's remember there's a lot of VCs in the room. What's the batting average for VCs? We're happy with 1 out of 10's a home run, 2 out of 10 return their money. Big corporations aren't used to those kind of batting averages. So it's really important that those failures are contained, compartmented, and can happen in air cover. Third is using your data as currency. We talked about on the first panel AI. AI is meaningless unless we have data to operate on. And so how are you going to take your data assets in a responsible way and turn them into an algorithmic advantage? Better personalized experiences, better operational decisions, and create what we call a data flywheel. Well, flywheels are things that gain speed as you add mass to them, right? So if we can do things like add more data because we interact with our customers with great experiences, they share more data. And then our algorithms get better, and we deliver better products and services. And we start to move to the right side of the hump. Fourth is, there's a lot of smart people that live outside the walls of our company. Sometimes I didn't feel that when I started my career at Lockheed. Maybe we thought we could do everything, right? I always said the term, WKE, we know everything. The reality is we don't, and in a digital world, disruption's happening so fast that the only way you can keep up is to tap into the outside world. But that means turning your company inside out. It means exposing your assets, your data, your insights, your expertise to a whole crop of innovators that you haven't dealt with before. And as we know, a lot of big companies, they can find the butterfly, but they often crush it because they don't understand how to operate and partner with small innovators on the outside. 5 is valuing talent over technology. My colleagues at Heidrick obviously think about this a lot, but it's really 2 parts. One is, in a digital world, we have to have enough digital talent, the 3 Ds, design, development, data science. That's table stakes. But what about the roles that are going to allow us to shift the way we work and really tap into the full value of digital? Roles like product incubation managers, people that understand how to experiment in a lean, agile way in a incubator environment and bring that back in to the business and have the institutional knowledge, are T-shaped enough to actually bring it to a commercial product or impact in the core business. Those bridge builders. Second, behavioral scientists, people that can take our data and actually figure out what kind of positive behaviors for our customers and employees we're trying to drive. Third is company roles like AI specialists. We think of AI people sitting in some dark corner and being water walkers to basically find new patterns in our data. AI is going to have to be something that every function in the business, whether it's HR or legal or supply chain, think about how it's going to change their model, how they're going to reinvent their part of the business. And I think that those translators, those dot connectors are going to be really important. And lastly, I think is most important, is reframing your purpose. So we talked a little bit about it before. If you don't have a compelling purpose in the digital world, not only will you be narrow-minded in thinking about the innovation opportunities for your business, you will also not attract the next generation of digital innovators. So you have to challenge yourself to have a purpose that's going to provide those kind of pathways. So real quickly, I want to share a story on each role. This is Mary Barra. You may recognize her. She took over as CEO of GM in 2014. Interestingly enough, was an engineer by training and became an HR leader. Very cool combination and very relevant to what we talk about today. But more importantly, Mary Barra took a company that had been known as a laggard on innovation and basically said, we need to come up with a step change outcome that will drive us as a company. And there were 3 things happening in the car world, right? What were they? Autonomy, electrification, and sharing. She said, we need a 10x outcome that will take us to the next level on all 3. So what did they do? She said, we're going to be a 000 company. 0 crashes, 0 congestion, 0 emissions. You can't possibly get there as just an auto manufacturer. You have to participate at the transportation level. So they invested in Lyft, about $500 million, which is going to be a nice payoff for them very soon. In ride sharing, they also launched their own ride sharing company called Maven, car by the hour, to support gig workers that need cars for delivery, for transport, other things. Now launched in 40 cities. They paid $1 billion to buy a company called Cruise out in Silicon Valley because they realized they were behind on autonomy and they had to have it as part of their 10x outcome. Third is they took all their institutional knowledge around electrification, just like Apple launched a failed product called the Newton many years before it launched the iPhone. General Motors had something called the EV1. Do you remember that? Back in 1996, first mass market electric car. Epic failure, tons of learning and institutional knowledge still in the company that they were able to tap into when they launched the Volt in 2010 and eventually the Bolt in 2016, Motor Trend Car of the Year. So somewhat of a Goliath running at a second speed by driving a 10x outcome. The second one, you saw Jess on stage from MasterCard. MasterCard is unbelievably committed to innovation. And they look at both little I and big I as a continuum. They actually run a program called Take Initiative with their employees. 48 hours a year, there's a global hackathon where employees are given the time to work on ideas and concepts. Those flow up into a program called Idea Box. An Idea Box, those ideas that get selected go into something called Orange Box. They get a prepaid credit card and 60 days to come up with a concept that they pitch to an investment committee. If they get through that, they go to Red Box and get 90 days and a bigger prepaid credit card to go build a prototype. And if they get through Red Box, then they go pitch to Ajay Banga, the CEO of the company. Pretty busy guy, but that's the commitment to innovation. If they get selected out of Red Box, they then become a virtual startup within MasterCard Labs for 6 months in what's called Green Box. They get to leave their position and role in the company and go pursue that venture. And the cool thing is MasterCard says we win both ways. We win with new products and services. We also win because we just trained a whole bunch of people in what it means to think differently and design agile, lean mindsets, and they send them back into their day jobs, and they call them innovation masters. And those people then become evangelists and teachers and mentors for others to do innovation in the company. So phenomenal kind of program in terms of commitment to innovation with real teeth. Rule 3. We talked about the weather a little bit. One of the coolest companies on the planet that is now part of IBM is the Weather Channel. And the Weather Channel was known to most of us as a media company. We'd see Jim Cantori blowing in the wind out there reporting on the weather. But under the covers, David Kinney and Bryson Kohler, the CTO at the time, realized our real crown jewel is our data. And yet our data is strewn all over the place. We've got these 200 meteorologists. We've got 108 weather patterns. We've got 13 data centers. So they went through a transformational process to say, our future is about, our 10X is about being the weather insights company of the future. And that's what they went through in a journey. They collapsed all their data into a single accessible data set. They now have 25,000 partners hitting their API 26 billion times a day. Fathom that. How much weather is being integrated into everyday decisions. They've integrated data from Apple Watches, from 50 million Apple Watches, so whether you realize it or not, you're sharing your barometric data with the Weather Channel, okay? And they've managed to create partnerships that have put them in a position now where they're adding to that data flywheel over time. So you think about somebody like a media property that's now become a data company, and it's all because they shifted the mindset of the company to say, we're going to win with data. Data is more valuable than capital to us. We need to create a platform that unlocks the value of that. Also, one of my favorite examples, because I was a satellite guy when I started my career, this is NASA. In 2005, NASA got their budget whacked in half. So imagine if you were an organization and you were told you have 50% less budget tomorrow. So they clearly couldn't do innovation the same way anymore. They couldn't pay the large contractors to go do R&D, or they couldn't pay their own large bands of scientists. They said, we've got to turn this model inside out. We have to tap into innovators around the world to solve our problems. So they committed to collaborative open innovation networks. They started getting people trained on describing NASA's key problems that they wanted to solve. And they started putting them out there to the world on platforms like Incentive and Kaggle and Yet2. They put the first 12 problems out there. They got 2,900 solvers in 80 countries to respond. Not bad for a first wave And I think one of the most interesting ones was something called solar flares, which do a lot of damage to satellites. They carry a lot of radiation. If you know when they're coming, you can do some things to mitigate. So NASA's scientists, for decades, the best they could do was, in a 24-hour window, they could predict a solar flare with 50% accuracy. NASA zipped up all its data. They described the problem. They put it out to the world. A retired radio engineer in the Midwest came up with a solution 3 weeks later that had an algorithm that can predict at 85% accuracy within 8 hours when a solar flare was coming. They paid $10,000 for that innovation. Not bad, right? So sometimes we have to challenge our own mindsets and, once again, we know everything mentality and say there are really smart people out in the world if we can actually unlock our assets and get it into their hands. Very hard to do as a big company. You might know this guy in this picture. He's been on the Philly scene a little while. He didn't come from Philly. A guy named Roy Rosen. In 2012, he actually did a major body transplant. He left Silicon Valley as the head of innovation at Intuit, and he came to Penn Medicine, a 250-year-old health system. After beating his head against the wall for about a year or two, Roy actually brought a completely new way of working into Penn. But what he realized was the crown jewel of Penn Medicine was its clinicians, was its unbelievable medical knowledge. And so what Roy did was say, what if we graft the two together? What if we take all that deep institutional knowledge around medicine and science, and we marry it with new ways of working and new thinking? So we bring in both ecosystems of startups, we bring in engineers from Penn Engineering, business thinkers from the Wharton School, and he started to create these cross-functional teams and a new environment for creating innovation, and the results were dramatic, right? The ability to test and pilot 8 ideas in a 90-day period, unheard of in healthcare, right? The ability to launch new products like PACT, which is doing community-based medicine and delivering about $2 of benefit for every $1 invested. Or the ability to actually rethink things like the NICU and mother's milk management, where they're saving 7,000 hours by using advanced technologies. So this is taking a very established institution and bringing new ways of working in. And once again, it's not just about the technology. In this case, it's about bringing the right talent together around the problem. And the last one I want to talk about is Discovery Health in South Africa. So in 1992, South Africa was coming out of apartheid, moving to democracy. The insurance industry had a bit of a dilemma because they didn't have data on a huge swath of the population. And a guy named Adrian Gore, who was an actuary from that same insurance industry, said, now's the time to rethink the insurance model because it's completely broken. All we do is push risk and lack of transparency on people instead of actually giving them the ability to lead healthier lives and manage or co-share in the value of the insurance. So they launched a company called Vitality, which is now the largest wellness platform in the world. They partnered with Apple to provide data from the Apple Watch into your wellness program, provide you a personal dashboard, because they realized that 50% of outcomes are driven by lifestyle decisions in health, right? Smoking, exercise, diet. And the ability to help people manage those more effectively is a much better investment than just telling them what their premium is. And this had a huge payoff for them, and once again, wild success around the world. So how does this all come together? There's a thing called a Parthenon in Greece. If you've been there, it's been there 2,500 years. It survived floods, fires, marauders, wars. And in many ways, it's like a company, right? The ability to reinvent and stand the test of time requires that you invest in the kind of things that are going to set you up for running at 2 speeds. And at the base of this is your purpose. At the top of it is your 10x outcome. What is that step change you're going to drive as a company? And then your pillars. What you don't want to do is make the mistake a lot of companies that approach us make and say, we want to hire a gold-plated chief digital officer who's going to solve all of this, right? They're going to come in, they're going to figure it all out. instead of realizing that digital is not about a collection of technologies or things or even a, quote, project, it is a shift in mindset and way of working. It is everybody's job in the company. If you're an HR leader, if you're a CFO, if you're the CMO, or you're running a line of business, it doesn't matter. This is also your job. Doesn't mean you don't want a CDO to lead the charge or attack certain aspects of innovation, but it shouldn't be outsourced or offloaded to one role in the company, for sure. Instead, what you should be focusing on is how do we build digital dexterity in our teams, our leaders, and our people. We call these digital triathletes, people that can look ahead, see the trends, like what we talked about with deep learning or blockchain, connect the dots to their part of the business, and understand the potential impact. They don't have to be technologists. They have to have the foresight and the aptitude to connect the dots. They also need to be digital drivers to actually do real stuff, take that technology and empower their teams to go build real impact and scale it, which is often the issue. We get stuck in pilot hell. And then lastly, they need to be digital innovators. They need to create space, safe space for experimentation of that second speed, that reinvention that needs to be separated until it's ready to be brought back into the business and create the pathways for that. This goes for every role. And it's something you guys should be thinking about. And I'm going to invite Peter up on stage, but the last thing I want to leave you with before we start the Q&A is at the end of the day, all this stuff is great. And believe me, I'm a technologist, so I love technology. The technology wheel will keep spinning. AI, blockchain, son of blockchain, it doesn't matter. It really will come down to how fast your organization can learn and adapt. So how are you building people, roles, structures that allow that to happen is much more important than picking the right technology today or tomorrow. So that's my main message, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks.
Cool. Scott, is this on? Yeah, Scott, I'm indebted to you for the story about the Domino's specialized vehicle for pizza delivery. I took the liberty while you were talking of doing a little more research on it. And, the pizzas slide into slots, the caller's address already inferred from phone number, communicate to the car, automatic route to there to get that 30-minute guarantee down. But I've just played a trick on you because the words I was just reading were not from the description of the Domino's vehicle in 2015, but do you recognize them? From a book called Snow Crash, written in 1992. So 23 years before Domino's rolled out that vehicle, Neil Stephenson had written a detailed description of something that very easily could have inspired that thing, and it made me think about other parallels. The Motorola flip phone, the StarTAC, which looks very much like a flip-up communicator, and Leonard Nimoy told stories about people seeing him using a flip phone and laughing hysterically because, of course, it looked exactly like a scene from the 1966 show 30 years before. And I'm wondering if the next edition of your book will add another rule, read more science fiction.
It's really, I'm glad you brought that up, Peter, because people ask me, like, how do you practice foresight? And yeah, it's easy to read what's being written now, but I do say read science fiction. Like, dig in, challenge your mind, stretch yourself, because a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, things like telepresence that seemed, undoable a couple of decades ago is like mainstream now. Right?
And also one of the comments from the panel that, two panels before you, when someone said, one of the advantages of bringing the business people into the technology conversation is that they aren't so good at knowing what can't be done. And they draw a picture of what they want, and someone actually said in the session before, well, the technology problems will all get solved.
Absolutely.
Which is kind of a breathtaking statement, and yet they've kind of got a point. Anything that doesn't actually involve splitting a proton into its subparts, which I don't think we have any of those yet. Yeah. But it is really quite remarkable.
And do we have to unwire ourselves as engineers? Because in many ways, the people that aren't engineers aren't as encumbered with, certain rote knowledge and formulas that we want to fit things into boxes. And I was probably very guilty of that too, coming up in a very deep discipline of engineering, and I had to completely create that other T part of my thinking and the critical thinking to challenge my assumptions that not everything fits a formula.
Well, I'm indebted to Jessica Turner from the blockchain panel for introducing the word crazy into today's conversation by saying, you know, people ask you, are you crazy? And she says, no, I don't think we are. And was it Apple that used to do the ad campaign, here's to the crazy ones?
Yeah.
The willingness to be accused of being crazy dates back. In 1971, for example, the US government wanted to private sector the internet. They didn't really want to run this thing at scale. It had been an interesting prototype, but they wanted someone to take it over and run it. And they came to AT&T with essentially an offer to take over this internet thing and run it so that it would be available as a public utility. And AT&T turned them down. They said this packet technology, it's not going to achieve the kind of scale and reliability that our customers need. You know, circuit switch networks are clearly the way to go. What an extraordinary moment. I mean, one of those moments when you can say, there was a 5-minute period in which the world forked, and on one path was embracing where the puck is going to go, and the other is saying, no, we like the puck right here where it is.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons when we talk about big I and little I innovation, we're big fans of what we call venture investment boards, and we'd recommend a healthy dose of outsiders on those boards that aren't running one of your current business units or functions only because they're not encumbered and they can see things through neutral eyes of what the market potential or experience might be instead of saying, well, that doesn't really fit the way we think about the world in our business. So, yeah.
Well, you know, it occurred to me that it wouldn't be surprising if you had actually made at least one Star Trek reference in your book. So I checked the index and didn't find it there. So again, you're room for a second edition.
We'll do it.
But right where Star Trek would have been in the index was something else. Shark Tank. There's a Shark Tank reference in the book, and it made me think about a whole bunch of related ideas from there. For example, you can always count on, I'm pretty sure it's Kevin, at some point to look someone intently in the eye and say, tell me what's your cost to acquire a customer. Wonderful question. And it reminded me of what Peter Drucker, of course, famously said. Ultimately, the purpose of a business is to create a customer. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the question of, you know, how do you visualize the customer for that which does not yet exist? And build the case for these people are out there. They're waiting for us to bring them this thing.
Yeah, it's the hardest thing. You know, there's lots of data. George Day from Wharton has some really great data. Companies fail more often when they go into new market segments they don't understand, customer bases they don't understand, versus when they sell newer technology to their existing customers.
Yes.
Because they tend to understand those customers' needs. They've been closer to them. And I know we were guilty of this at Lockheed quite a bit. We're like, yeah, we could sell broadband to the consumer market. We didn't know anything about the consumer market, right? So until you really understand the psyche, the anthropology of those customer bases, most companies are very inept at doing that. So you should really check your own assumptions more often. And that's where big I for different companies comes in different flavors. Some companies say, you know what, we can't do this internally. We need to use corporate venturing to go use other platforms as ways to incubate our thinking and test our knowledge. In other cases, we might, you know, Kelly Johnson in 1943 pitched a circus tent a mile from the Palmdale facility at Lockheed because he said, I can't be in this building if we're going to do something dramatically different, and we're going to understand what the needs are. So,
and the origin of the term Skunk Works was, in fact, that exercise where they put the Skunk Works, based, I believe, on a reference from the Little Abner comic strip on the pennant outside the building.
So I think every company's, you know, what I'd recommend is don't take the formula of company X and try and adopt it in your company. That's a formula for failure.
You mean we're going to be the Uber of? Is that a business plan?
Or, you know, Walmart did this kind of lab structure. Why can't we do it? Or they did that kind of data organization. So I think you have to figure out what's going to work in your culture, your organization to get that second speed. But understanding future customer needs, I think both has to be data-driven and a little bit genius-driven. You've got to tap into those radical thinkers out there that have completely different viewpoints of what that future customer need could be.
So we're going to be nonconformist and daring just like everybody else.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's not let that happen. You made a reference earlier on to Apple taking something that Xerox PARC, of course, had produced. Now PARC no longer calls itself Xerox PARC. PARC still exists as a private company with a museum, in fact, of the things they invented,
which is amazing.
None of which they ultimately commercialized, which is a shockingly consistent record of failing to realize that this could be brought to market not as a $10,000 Xerox Alto, but as a $2,000 Macintosh. The famous conversation between Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, where Steve said, we trusted you and you're stealing from us, and Bill said, actually, Steve, I think it's more like I broke into my neighbor Xerox's house to steal the TV, but you had already taken it.
That's right.
And the phrase sometimes attributed to Picasso, genius steals. Does genius steal? Should we be vigorous and candid about saying, we realize this is not a brand new idea, but here's why the way we're going to bring it to market is going to be mind-blowing. For example, Ray Wang at Constellation points out that when the iPod was introduced, Sony had 3 different divisions building MP3 players, competing against each other, and yet 3 years later, the Oxford English Dictionary called things podcasts. They redefined the act of getting stuff off the net through that device, which was the experience that was wrapped around it.
I think this is the biggest impediment in big companies is the fear of losing their IP. Even when they're not unlocking the value of it themselves. I won't name the company, but a large technology player had the equivalent of TiVo in its R&D arm. It invested $30 million in it.
Yes.
And then ultimately some exec came in and said, we're not going to deploy that because that will piss off our cable customers. And instead of spinning it out, they just let it die.
And let someone else disrupt them instead of disrupting themselves.
Yeah, so this notion of unlocking the value, I think it takes a shift in mindset. It takes a little bit of courage because some people said it before, maybe the notion of stealing is different in this world, right? Of a world of transparency where everybody kind of knows what everybody else is doing. I think how do we become more responsible in sharing the load on developing IP? I think that's where blockchain gets really interesting. There's actually a fund in Europe that's developing a way where nonprofits can collaborate and all the contributions to the IP are written on the blockchain so you can go resurrect how, what share of the IP should you own? And I think we're going to have more creative ways. If we're going to really tap into partners, share assets, companies have to get over that hurdle of, protecting my IP.
I've never heard the blockchain model applied to the currency of ideas as being opposed to being applied to a currency of transaction before, and that is a really
kind of puts that out there in the transparency realm, right? So
and so many questions do ultimately turn on, can you prove prior art? Can you prove, origination? And this is a very interesting possibility. It's so important to decouple blockchain from cryptocurrency. Yes. I've heard people calling it the crypto crisis when they really mean the cryptocurrency crisis, which is sad because cryptography has never been in a better position to start revolutionizing our ability to do stuff.
Yeah, and I thought the last panel did a great job of really getting to the real use cases. There was currency aspects and monetary aspects, but they also talked about the power of the platform. So
this brings up an interesting question, which is when you're building teams today, who are you hiring? The colleges are not turning out people with cryptocurrency majors, and yet a cryptocurrency regulator would have to be able to hold his or her own in a conversation about network protocols, financial regulation, and any number of other things. That someone earlier today, I think it was Chris Wilhelm, said we had this breakfast conversation where the techies are no longer allowed to sneer at the suits, and the suits are no longer allowed to dismiss the egghead techies. They all actually have to understand each other's vocabularies and points of view.
Yeah, this really is. I mean, you're rarely going to find the T-shaped person walking around in the wild. You have to go create it. We talk about in the book skill grafting. So this notion of taking people with deep institutional knowledge, whether it's around regulation or how banking transactions work, and marrying those with people that bring in completely new ways of working, and get them working side by side, almost as twins and in teams, because we've seen that unlock the most power. It's when companies say, we're going to go create a digital lab over here. We're going to hire a bunch of cool kids with T-shirts and jeans who know nothing about our business. They're going to come up with big ideas. And what happens? It's like organ rejection times 10 because there's no bridge, right? There's nobody that understands the realities of how you're going to bring that to life in a regulated environment. So I think what we're seeing work now is companies in version 2 of these labs and studios are really grafting those skills together, and I think they're starting to get the payoff of having both.
So is the pendulum swinging from the only way you can innovate is to go create the Skunkworks in the separate building or fly the pirate flag over the building the way Steve Jobs did, to what Kevin Justice talked about, where they intentionally make sure these people are all working on the same floor and can't not run into each other at
Yeah, I think it's the pirate flag and the company flag on the same building, but it's got a separate environment and it's got people circulating through there. Just like we talked about MasterCard, this Innovation Masters program, just because you work in finance doesn't mean you can't work on a lean agile project and do dynamic financial plans as part of a startup team and then bring that learning back to your function. So I think this notion that it becomes a tour stop for your talent to learn those skills, work in that environment, you'll recycle some of those folks that are incredibly good at driving those ventures, but you also create a culture that's used to doing that in every function in the business. I don't think it can be, you can afford to just invest in having it done in one corner of the business.
No, and it's interesting that the original architecture of the MIT buildings was considered quite radical because you didn't have separate buildings for the departments. You had this big connected structure with big doorways and flat floors intended to allow for that to happen.
Rotation. Yeah.
And now that's being realized in Cupertino by the so-called spaceship that Apple's building, where that circular design is meant to make it so natural for people to wind up walking through other areas. I'm shocked to realize the last time I looked at the clock, we had 6 minutes to go, and now we're down to much less than that. But I'm sure that we have 10 minutes left. Oh, you mean you finished that early?
Wow.
Oh, well
that was
done. We
good.
still have 10 minutes.
Excellent.
Okay. Oh, in fact, they just restarted. Great. In that case, let me open it to the floor because I suspect that a lot of people would like to know how they can make this operational in their own organizations. I see mic runners out. I see a hand behind you.
We'll take questions from Goliaths or Davids, doesn't matter, either one.
Hey, Scott, how you doing? Brock Weather up back here.
Hey, Brock.
Question for you of like organizations, large organizations especially, a lot of stuff that you talked about is cultural change for large organizations. One of the big gaps that I've seen a lot of it is just knowledge, right? Like, you know, if you're a startup person, Agile is an easy concept, right? And the fast fail and those sorts of things. Have you seen companies create training programs and do that successfully to take what I would call a traditional line corporate, person and help teach them the skills in addition to the cultural element of it? And how does that work? Have you seen that work well?
Yeah, there are a number of companies that we're familiar with that are actually, kind of what we just talked about with Peter, the rotational program where, some call it an intrapreneur program, some call it internal venture leaders, MasterCard calls it Innovation Masters, but it's this notion that you're almost building up another path of skill sets that you can get, badged or certified in of design thinking, lean startup thinking, applying dynamic financials. All those things can be part of that separate track and building those cross new ways of working skill sets. We're seeing a number of companies do that now as a very deliberate, we want to know how much of our workforce has been trained in these new ways of applying it. Some of those folks, the other thing we found in some of the companies we work with is by doing that training, you actually see who the people are that are capable of working on big I initiatives, that have those attributes in spades, those entrepreneurial characteristics, as well as obviously giving people an appreciation for how they can apply them in the little I side. So it really serves as two purposes. One is it's an audition for your talent as they go through that training, and we're big fans of applied learning, right? So do it with a real innovation program, and then you're sending a crop of people back to their business with new ways of thinking. And I think the success rate is pretty high in that kind of training. Most people just don't have access to it.
If I could add anecdotal support on that, the first of several times that Forbes magazine named Salesforce World's Most Innovative Company, they did a backstory on, is there a moment at which you did something or made a choice that led in the direction of becoming a reliable generator of a cadence of innovation? And they came to the conclusion that in 2006, the decision to address some metrics they weren't they didn't like seeing about declining release frequency, declining software quality. They said, we're going to fix this. We're going to move to agile processes within the company. And that intention, which had to be driven CEO down, because many people believed you could not build enterprise software with anything other than the traditional waterfall model. It had to be founder-led, and that's an important.
That's a great point. And back to Brock's question is, too often this is like allocated to the training group or the HR function.
Yeah.
The reality is my leaders should want to know what percentage of our population is now able to work in this new way. And
because
support
beware the
agile
bright, shiny object. I know one organization that was putting people through Lean Six Sigma training because that was the big thing. Well, Six Sigma training makes total sense when your bell curve is wide and you're making 20 million light bulbs a year like you do at used to do at GE,
Sure.
where that came. But the idea of doing statistical processes in this company, which built products that were at most built in quantities of a dozen or so, being in the aerospace area, was arguably just not a good fit. It was a label that enjoyed considerable currency and popularity, but they were trying to graft it onto an industry where it didn't work. And that was, I think, where you opened the conversation, is beware of attempting to apply a pattern that pays no attention to the actual nature of your market and your customer.
Yeah, and that's probably why quite a few chief digital officer hires haven't made it past the half-life of like 1.5 to 2 years, because it's the clash of cultures and not understanding that the underlying platform hasn't been changed.
Another thing that we've tried to do internally is make it really quite easy for people to apply for jobs for which they're not qualified within the company, because lateral movement and retraining actually turns out to be so much cheaper than hiring a new person. And that's a cost that's so often buried, as you said, over in some overhead area. And you don't realize, we're going to spend $30,000 hiring someone whose resume is perfect. We could take someone who already knows our culture, knows our company, and let them acquire the skills on the job for a fraction of that $30,000.
I mean, we have to remember, we are in a world now where employees don't work for companies, companies work for employees. And if you don't have a commitment and a path to developing your employees faster, 45% of digital natives will leave a company if they don't feel like they're going to learn fast enough.
If they don't feel that they're learning, if they
And
don't
they're
feel
developing fast enough. Yeah, it's huge. And I actually talked to a financial service firm that had a completely contrarian view, much like you brought up the first call resolution paradigm that's being busted now.
Yeah.
The other one that's being busted is they actually said, we're okay with a 20% attrition rate, which sounds very high for a lot of companies, because we feel like if we're known as a company where people can develop faster, that will create a bigger engine of growth, even if we lose some of those people because they're so good. We feel like it means we're still providing an engine where people want to come work for us.
Among the other numbers to look at, you can look at the gross attrition number.
Yeah.
We also try to look at our boomerangs, because people who've left and found out, oh my gosh, it really does suck out here. Can I come back, please?
Or better yet, they landed a customer and want to buy it.
Because then they tend to bring their friends too. They find some really good people and say, hey, you know what? I'm going back. Would you like to come? Well, I want to get at least one more question in the room. There was the woman in purple. You had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, hi, I'm Melissa Scrimo.
I couldn't see your face. All I could see was the purple.
That's
Sorry.
okay.
Yeah.
That's why I wore it right. I work in the pharmaceutical industry, and one of the big challenges that I encounter is resistance to change, and a lot of it has to do with the regulatory compliance, and they're very set in their ways of doing things. So I would love to hear your suggestions on how you can overcome resistance as you're trying to move forward with new ways of working and new ideas.
Yeah, I think it's very, I actually sit on the board of a bank, so I know all about regulation, and I think it was addressed well on some of these panels as well. It's real. And I actually would flip it around and say, instead of regulation being the barrier or the drag factor, turn it into a legacy asset. You guys know more about working the regulatory system than a startup does. Can you bottle that up and package that expertise in a way that you could expose it to allow some of those innovators to run faster on your platform, instead of saying, you know what, we can't do this or that internally because of regulation. So I think I challenge you, one, is to package up that expertise and that depth you have and make it an asset, make it a crown jewel. And then I think the second is, in some industries, pioneering companies are going to have to lead the regulators. It happened in mobile medical devices in healthcare. The FDA didn't have an arm that even understood what a smartphone was, let alone a medical app or one that could make clinical decisions. Now they've created a whole arm that can approve mobile medical devices, and I would argue they're actually moving at a pretty good clip. But the more the industry can educate the regulators and take a pioneering position, the better off we're going to be.
Your question also reminds me of something that we've done a little beating up on AT&T today, but I want to throw them one bouquet. Where at the Pacific Telecom Forum, someone at AT&T said, a lot of people at AT&T would like to believe our defining expertise is our ability to construct a global network. But upon internal analysis and reflection, we realized our real defining expertise is that we know more than any other company in the world about how to function in the multi-jurisdictional model of global regulation of communications.
Yeah.
We could hire people to lay cables, but turning that idea that our regulatory environment is a friction into our mastery of our regulatory environment as a competitive advantage is a very interesting Jedi mind trick.
And I beat up AT&T, but I also want to throw them a prop. They've created one of the largest ecosystems in the world, and Abby Engels here, he's going to be on the panel in the afternoon, where innovators can come in and build and innovate on top of their network and the assets and the expertise of AT&T, and they invest very little capital. It's more sweat equity and investment of expertise because they want those startups and innovators to build new big-hitting applications that are going to use the network. So it's a great example of an ecosystem say, listen, we got to empower these people.
And this is not limited to the high-tech world. We're working with a large grocery chain in another country in which they have realized, and we are working with them actively on this, that rather than trying to develop their own little specialty operations within the store, they can provide an environment in which local boutiques can come in and do pop-up stores under the umbrella of the big grocery store. Let them continue to do what they are very, very good at doing while still having those sprinkles on the latte that make people say, oh, this is a cool place to shop, not just where I'm going to buy my milk and my bread. And being able to see those opportunities for triangulation is so powerful. Can we try to squeeze in one more question? I see the gentleman with his hand up in the back. Oh, hi, Phil.
Hey, Phil.
Yeah. Microphone is on the way.
Yep. So as a David who sold to Goliath 5 times, I guess the big question I have, and a terrible employee, I'm unemployable. Just track record proves it.
By choice.
Track record proves it. The biggest challenge I've seen, maybe you can discuss this, is not coming up with an idea that fails in a big organization, but coming up with one that's successful. Because then all of a sudden, legal wants to jump in, finance wants to jump in.
How do you survive the success of your brilliant idea?
The jaws of culture, right? A big
just,
company.
Oh no! Now it's going to be a profit center.
Somebody had the meeting thing, so it goes from one meeting, a day to 30 meetings a day.
Well, I think there's 2 things there. One is on the acquisition side. There's some companies that have learned the hard way. John Chambers at one point in Cisco had 100 former CEOs on his payroll, which means he kept those people and he gave them a reason to stay and a reason to basically put them on the next big venture because he recognized those skill sets of being able to run that part of the relay race, of taking a concept to actually something of commercial impact mattered. So he tried to create an environment where those people wanted to stay versus wanted to leave, like most entrepreneurs when they get acquired. I think the second part is really, I think it's really about creating a functional layer in your innovation mix. So there's legal, finance, compliance, all those folks, cyber, they have to be part of the innovation studio or lab or that second speed. They have to understand where they're becoming the impediment or they're the drag factor, and they have to innovate their function. I can tell you about a Canadian bank who took basically a 6-month process to pilot with a startup down to 6 weeks, took a 20-page contract with lots of liabilities laying on the startup and took it to 2 pages. So it can be done in a regulated industry, but it takes work and it takes the will of all those other functions to do it.
Among the defining skill sets of PACT is that they keep their events running on time. If you could see the size of the screen in front of the thing, please wrap up right now.
We're getting
You would
disrupted.
understand why I'll have to say thank you, and we're both around for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Any other questions, please let us know.
Thanks, guys.
Scott, fantastic.
Appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you.
Peter.